Every year, £1.25 billion is stolen from the NHS. That's money meant for doctors and nurses to run hospitals and to help us all when we fall ill. We're on the hunt with the crack teams of investigators.
This is a huge theft on a grand scale.
The treatment that he received hadn't happened. This is a fraud.
Tracking down the fraudsters, stealing public money.
They actually talk about, is what we're doing fraud? We are the villains, aren't we?
Locking them up and getting the cash back where it belongs.
Just under £1.5 million is going to be paid to some of the victims in our case.
Just over £23,000 back into the public purse.
The fraud squad is on the case. Today, a highly organised scam doubling up timesheets of agency staff swindles over £70,000 from a number of different hospitals.
They were both for shifts for the same period of time, but on different wards. I could tell there was going to be one of those was going to be false. It was just a matter of identifying which one was false.
And a GP practice manager pockets thousands of pounds by faking emails to award himself a pay rise.
There is a £10,000 difference between what it was due in terms of bonus, which was £20,000, and what he'd actually paid himself, which was £30,000.
The NHS currently has an annual budget of over £120 billion. Now, that might sound like a lot, but when you consider that it serves around 65 million of us, every single penny of it counts. This is a story of a woman who thought that the NHS budget was big enough that no one would notice if she used it as a personal bank account for her and her partners in crime. A world-renowned hospital is fleeced. Hundreds of thousands of pounds is gone. Money meant for vital cancer drugs. The Royal Marsden, London, a world leader in cancer care. A pharmaceutical company, which supplies the hospital with some of its drugs, discovers that 4 invoices haven't been paid. And the total amount of money in question is staggering, over £180,000.
They looked into their systems and they realised they hadn't been paid for about 3 or 4 weeks in a row.
The hospital is notified of the problem.
The Royal Marsden Finance Department looked at their systems and they noticed that the bank account details for this particular supplier had been changed.
With weeks of invoices unpaid, the company supplying the drugs lets the hospital know that the repercussions could be serious.
They contacted the trust and said, look, if you're not going to pay our invoices, then we're sorry, but we're not going to supply any more pharmaceuticals to the trust. If the supply of medicines to the Royal Marsden is interrupted for any reason, clearly that's a significant risk to the patients there.
There's no time to waste. The hospital needs to find out what's going on.
It transpired that the bank account details of 5 suppliers in total had been changed.
And there's one thing the newly discovered transactions have in common.
All of those other changes were made when one particular member of staff's details were input.
It's an immediate breakthrough. The woman in question works at the hospital as an accounts payable officer.
An accounts payable officer is a position of trust because the individuals have access to payment systems, and those payment systems are dealing with hundreds of thousands of pounds, millions of pounds a year.
With the bank accounts of at least 5 drug suppliers changed, and with the accounts department employee as a suspect, the hospital gets national counter-fraud investigator Pat Dacey on the case.
This file came onto my desk, and the first thing to do was to go to the accounts payable department and find out about their systems.
The department informs Pat that even though the drug suppliers didn't get their payments, the money did leave the hospital bank account, and lots of it.
They saw that the invoices had been paid, but they'd been paid to a different account.
Pat adds up the amount missing. The final figure is staggering.
The amount of money involved was over £650,000, so we're not talking small beer here.
Later, the hospital worker is arrested and blows the case wide open.
She said she'd done it under duress. She'd basically had 3 individuals all making threats against her and her family.
There's a massive shortage of nurses in the NHS, with hospitals up and down the country struggling to fill their job vacancies. It means hospitals are having to rely more and more on agency staff at a cost of a staggering £1.5 billion every year. But in our next case, a group of people hired to help instead conspire to steal from the public purse. By duplicating timesheets, they're paid for shifts they haven't worked, doubling their income and ultimately swindling the NHS out of £73,000. Scunthorpe General Hospital in North Lincolnshire. A nurse bank manager receives an invoice from a recruitment agency for the hours worked by an agency healthcare assistant. She then receives another invoice for the same man, but this time from a different recruitment agency. Strangely, it's for the same day and the same hours. With suspicions raised, the manager goes to her local counter-fraud officer, Nikki Foley, who checks the timesheets.
Straight away, I could see from looking at both the timesheets, they were both for shifts for the same period of time, but on different wards. So clearly he can't be working on one ward when he's meant to be working on another ward. I could tell there was going to be one of those was going to be false. It was just a matter of identifying which one was false.
Nikki starts by going into the hospital to speak to the ward manager, who, according to the timesheet, has authorised the hours the man worked. She shows him the document, and his response is utter shock.
Spelling of his name, in fact, was incorrect, and it wasn't his signature, and he hadn't authorised that timesheet.
So who has blatantly forged the ward manager's signature in order to sign off the claim for £150 worth of unworked hours?
I was able to analyse the timesheets in particular and check the authorising signatories. What I identified was that a ward manager had managed to sign their name in exactly the same place on a number of timesheets. So I did some transparencies, and when you overlaid a number of other timesheets, the authorising manager at the bottom, their name, their printing, the date was in exactly the same space, in exactly the same spot, which is very difficult to do.
Nikki's convinced a fraud is taking place. She heads back to the hospital, and suddenly the investigation gathers momentum.
So whilst reviewing the timesheets, I noticed that there were a number of timesheets in another care worker's name, and I noticed that the authorised signatories were the same.
The second worker is a staff nurse who's also employed by the recruitment agency ID Medical. They're an award-winning company who provides staff for over 90% of NHS trusts and are completely unaware they're being used. As Nikki looks through the second worker's timesheets, it's clear the conspiracy is much bigger than she'd first imagined, targeting at least 2 more hospitals and potentially swindling tens of thousands of pounds out of the National Health Service.
We must have had about 25 timesheets with fictitious authoriser name on them.
This is a deliberate scam. Nikki has the evidence she needs to start making arrests. Accompanied by the police, she goes to the home of the male healthcare assistant. He isn't there, but the team search his house and sees several items, including a receipt for a money transfer known as a MoneyGram. It's a game changer for the investigation.
I could prove that he was actually in Coventry when he alleged that he was in Scunthorpe undertaking a shift for us, because he was actually in the post office arranging for this moneygram to be sent. Interview under caution took place. He said he was going to provide a report for us that would give us lots of information, interesting information.
That information never materialises. The healthcare assistant is arrested, having failed to provide a statement. He's interviewed again. He eventually cracks and admits to creating false timesheets as a way of making more money.
It took a while before he admitted it. So when he did actually admit it, it was, we have the evidence in front of us, but to hear him actually say it, it's obviously good news for us because we knew we were on the right track.
Later, the team arrests the second healthcare worker. Could her text messages lead Nikki straight to the man behind the entire fraud?
He's sharing his address with her. He's given his bank details out so that she knows where to pay into.
To convict a fraudster, you need evidence. Most of the time, it's things like incriminating paperwork, texts, or emails. But sometimes it's the evidence that raises a few eyebrows.
One of the weirdest bits of evidence I've submitted for examination was a packet of coloured pencils. I was looking into a case which involved altering gyro checks. I was able to prove forensically that they were the same ones that had altered the gyro checks.
When you have to produce dentures in court and they're passed around the jury and the jury are sort of holding them with sort of one finger and thumb looking at these dentures that have been used, and you can see it on their faces, they find it absolutely gross, but it's part of the evidence.
A staggering £650,000 has gone missing from a world-renowned cancer hospital in London. Bank account details to key suppliers have been secretly changed, rerouting NHS money to private bank accounts. The prime suspect works in the hospital accounts department.
We came to her home address and had her arrested.
The woman is taken to the police station and processed into custody. Her computers and mobile devices are bagged and tagged, then sent off for expert analysis. Pat starts the interview, and the woman tells him she knows who's responsible.
That she hadn't done it, and it must have been done by the temps using her login details, because she had been asked by her managers to give these temps her login details for them to operate the system when she wasn't in the office.
Is there any truth in this latest twist?
I went back to the trust to interview the accounts payable staff, interview the temporary staff, and the managers there said, no, we would never instruct any of our staff to share their login details, their password details, it's just not done. And the temporary staff said, no, we were never given login details, so her account was just shown to be false.
As Pat scours the piles of invoices, he thinks he's beginning to understand the suspect's system.
So there was changing the invoice numbers. So, for example, you put a capital I instead of the letter 1, or a 0 instead of the letter O. Changing the number on the invoice slightly so the system didn't recognise it as a duplicate. She was also changing the email addresses so that when the payments were made out to the wrong bank accounts, obviously the supplier didn't get an email at that point to say they were being paid, because clearly they wouldn't have been paid.
With the evidence against the woman mounting, and with her claim about the temporary staff proved to be a lie, she's brought back in for a second interview.
She said that she had lied to us on the first occasion. The new account was that she'd made all the changes to the system and she'd done it under duress. She'd basically had 3 individuals all making threats against her and her family, threats of violence, if she didn't make these changes to the bank account details.
So where did she meet such a friendly-sounding group? During the interview, she informs Pat that she first met one of them at a summer barbecue with her boyfriend, Scott Chaplin.
During that conversation, apparently, Scott said that she worked in the accounts payable department of the Royal Marsden, where she was responsible for inputting details into the payment system.
In the hospital employee's latest version of events, she says the man she'd met at the barbecue soon paid her an unannounced visit with some friends.
They'd come round and jokingly, she said, they'd asked her if she could change the bank account details in the accounts payable system, and she just laughed and thought they were joking and sent them on their way.
But that wasn't the last she saw of them. A couple of weeks later, the woman claims they reappeared, this time making threats of violence against her and her family.
And they gave her a piece of paper with a bank account number on and left. And she said she just screwed it up into a ball and threw it in the bin and thought nothing more of it.
But apparently, their verbal threats soon became physical.
A couple of days later, Scott came home with an injured elbow, and he said he'd been attacked with a hammer for no apparent reason. She said that she put two and two together, and she thought this was threats of violence against her family. So she went to the bin, she pulled out the scrap of paper that she'd thrown in there a couple of days previously, took it to work the next day, and then started making changes to bank account details.
Later, mobile phone records lead Pat right to the ringleader. But who are they?
There was one number that we couldn't identify, but all of those other numbers communicating with that one number.
There are over 30,000 GPs in this country, and they're a talented bunch who can do it all, from injections and diagnosis to palliative care and even minor surgery. But one thing GPs don't do is run their practices. That important job is down to the practice manager, and for their hard work, they're rewarded with a salary of around £50,000. But for one practice manager, it isn't nearly enough. Emails forged, trust destroyed, and thousands of pounds of NHS funds stolen. The town of Bispham sits on the northwest coast, just outside of the popular seaside resort of Blackpool. It's home to the North Shore Surgery. Dr. Abid Hanif is part owner of the practice, which has proudly served its community for over 20 years.
We had a small practice in a residential area. We've slowly gotten bigger. We've moved to a purpose-built building.
Like all GP surgeries, North Shore needs a practice manager. And when it comes to hiring a new one, Dr. Hanif thinks he knows the perfect man for the job.
He was well known. He was a new manager in the town. His reputation preceded him a little bit in that sense. So we felt he was the kind of person that we wanted in the practice.
The new practice manager receives a warm welcome.
He settled into the surgery quite well. He was a friend and a colleague. He'd have an open door policy. You could go to him, you'd feel quite comfortable chatting to him about any issues, whether it was personal or work related. And at the end of the first year, everyone was happy with his performance, and we decided to reward him with a bonus of £5,000.
For 4 years, all went well. Then, out of the blue, Dr. Hanif receives an email from his payroll department about the practice manager's latest pay rise.
They asked me to authorise some changes to his pay.
Dr. Hanif immediately spots a problem.
You could see in the email thread an email which was reported to have come from me, authorising these changes. But that email wasn't from me. It was similar to one I did send, but it had been edited.
It appears as though he has increased his salary by £5,000. But to be sure, Dr. Hanif digs out his original email to compare it.
There were lots of similarities, but there was also some differences. Figures had been changed, and there was an extra line in there asking or claiming overtime.
It looks as though the practice manager is committing fraud against the very practice that employs him.
I felt angry that this had happened. I felt our trust had been betrayed.
Dr. Hanif confronts him about what's been going on.
He immediately admitted that he'd put the request in, he changed the email, he described it as an error of judgment, and he offered his resignation straight away.
To rule out the possibility of any other fraud, Dr. Hanif starts looking through the practice's bank records.
I asked for some information from the payroll company, and I was able to access the files with our bank statements in it.
The findings are deeply troubling.
My investigation revealed an estimated £10,000 was missing.
Dr. Hanif passes his findings on to NHS counter-fraud investigator Daryl Davies.
We knew that we needed to go up to the practice and to conduct a full search of the office of the practice manager, and also to ensure that we could gather all the available evidence that we needed.
When Daryl and his team arrive, they head straight to the practice manager's room.
We searched the office to look for any information that may assist us with our inquiries, and we found this diary for 2016.
In his forged email, the practice manager is claiming payment for 10 days of untaken annual leave, but his diary tells a different story.
I was able to construct this spreadsheet detailing all the annual leave that he'd actually undertaken during the year, and it soon became clear that actually he'd taken 28 days of annual leave against the 30 days to which he was entitled. This meant that the 10 days that he was claiming for on that email that he sent through to payroll was actually incorrect and not true. Essentially, this means that he's committing fraud by false representation to the payroll department. We realised we were dealing with something a bit bigger than we originally anticipated.
Later, Daryl unearths another email from another doctor, authorising another pay rise.
We spoke to the doctor concerned, and he had no recollection of sending that second email.
Two agency workers at Scunthorpe General Hospital are being investigated for submitting fraudulent timesheets. But as the case unfolds, it's starting to look like they could be just a small part of a massive scam. With one agency worker admitting to fraud, Nikki's next step is to arrest another. They go to search her home.
During this house search, there were a number of items seized. There were some timesheets to prove to be good evidence. The timesheets were all handwritten ID medical timesheets.
A closer look reveals the timesheets match two other sets the nurse had submitted through two other recruitment agencies.
So basically what we had there was 3 timesheets for the same day. So 1 legitimately worked by the other agency and 2 lots of false timesheets. So clearly you could see that they were not legitimate timesheets.
The nurse is questioned under caution about falsifying timesheets.
She came across as wanting to help. Immediately she held her hand up and said that yes, she had been involved in this dishonest act.
She then reveals the name of a man who she suggests is the brains behind the scam.
He was the recruitment consultant at ID Medical.
As the case unfolds, it appears all of the nurse's claims are correct, and ID Medical are completely unaware that one of their employees is the ringleader of this timesheet conspiracy.
This is obviously a well-planned fraud, as he would text her the dates that he would want her to create the fabricated timesheets for.
But Nikki needs hard evidence to prove the recruitment consultant's involvement. Could the nurse's mobile phone hold the key?
This is messages, obviously, between herself and
the recruitment consultant.
Finding these messages was obviously a very big find for us. He's sharing his address with her. He's given her dates for her to be able to create timesheets. He's given his bank details out so that she knows where to pay into. Clearly, building a relationship and continuing, and even here where it says about the 50-50 split. So obviously that's what they're going to do with the money when she gets paid it from the agency.
The more Nikki investigates, the more she starts to realise that this fraud isn't just confined to a few people and a few timesheets. Could it even be a nationwide scam? She passes the case over to Jerry Metcalf, an investigator at the National Counter-Fraud Authority.
Now there is more than one shift again, as you can see.
Straight away, he hones in on the recruitment consultant.
It became very evident that he was what I would describe as the main player.
The man started working with ID Medical in 2011 as a recruitment consultant.
He was somebody that had to recruit the nurses, run a team. He was expected to maintain a high level of work standards within ID Medical. He was well looked upon and was eventually promoted to a team leader. So therefore the company had an awful lot of trust in him.
A trust that the recruitment consultant exploited and abused. He used the agency to recruit temporary workers who he then conspired with to defraud the NHS by submitting false timesheets.
All of these demonstrate all the nurses have received their wages and they're paying a proportion of that to him. That is good evidence that shows the connection between him and each of the defendants.
ID Medical are made aware of the fraud and do all they can to assist the investigation. As Jerry and Nikki dig deeper, the case takes a sinister turn. They discover that the recruitment consultant has hijacked the identity of an agency nurse.
He was now getting very greedy. He now took total control of an email address, a bank account, and also submitting fraudulent timesheets himself. One of the nurses very much had her identity overtaken by the change of her email address and also by the bank account's details being changed. So any monies due in her name could actually be sent and forwarded to him. She never received any of her pay slips, so she never knew what money she actually did receive from the company.
The recruitment consultant is arrested. Under interview, he denies doing anything wrong.
He will say as follows: "I'm not guilty of fraud. I have not acted dishonestly while sending candidates to work with the NHS. I was responsible for sourcing candidates to send to the compliance department. The payroll department is completely independent to me, and I have no involvement in booking hours, timesheets, or anything like that."
The recruitment consultant can even explain the extra money going into his account.
Any monies that a candidate has paid into my account is a thank you gesture for arranging the work, not a result of any fraudulent activity. Perhaps as I'm the people's main point of contact, workers have falsely believed I'm involved in something I'm not. They have to blame someone, why not me?
The recruitment consultant protests his innocence. It will be up to the jury to decide, as Jerry and Nikki have enough evidence to take him to court. Ultimately, 7 people are suspected of being involved in the scam, stealing nearly £73,000 from the NHS. They all appear at Hull Crown Court. The 2 health workers plead guilty along with 1 other. The recruitment consultant, the brains behind the scam, pleads not guilty.
Initially, he was very confident. He was in the witness box for just under 2 days, during which time that confidence seemed to disappear. The change I saw from him was very much confrontational and disagreeing anything that the prosecuting barrister put to him. He was in total denial about submitting fraudulent timesheets and agreeing with the other defendants to do so.
After a trial lasting 4 weeks, the healthcare assistant receives a 15-month sentence and the staff nurse 8 months, both suspended for 2 years. The others are all found guilty, with the kingpin recruitment consultant sentenced to 3 years behind bars. Jerry and Nikki are now in the process of claiming back the money the recruitment consultant and his cronies made through their criminal activity.
This fraud is very much greed and trying to get something for nothing.
In the heart of a Blackpool community, NHS investigators believe a GP practice manager could be responsible for a £10,000 black hole in its precious budget. Daryl and his team have discovered the practice manager's work diary. They spend hours diligently inspecting its contents and soon discover that the annual leave discrepancy is just the tip of the iceberg.
The next step was to look at claims for overtime. As you can see there, at the end of July, the diary is indicating that he's had 6 hours and 45 minutes owing to him. So therefore, he's accumulated 6 hours between January and the end of July. But what can be seen here is essentially that he was claiming for 24 hours of overtime at the end of July, which is clearly a difference between the 6 hours that was owing.
And it doesn't appear to be a one-off. The diary entries show that he's got the nerve to do it on a regular basis. This is now a fraud involving bonuses, pay rises, overtime and holiday pay.
So what I did was look at all the bonus payments that he had received during the years that he'd worked at the GP practice. What soon became clear is that there was a variety of payments being made. What I did was analyse all those payments, and as can be seen in this spreadsheet here, there is a £10,000 difference between what he was due in terms of bonus, which was £20,000, and what he'd actually paid himself, which was £30,000.
How had the former employee managed to get away with taking £10,000 without anybody noticing? Daryl analyses the practice manager's old emails.
We identified an email dated the 14th of May 2015 from one of the former GPs at the surgery, authorising the payment of the bonus at that particular point in time.
Daryl is able to confirm that the email authorising the bonus is legitimately from the GP, but what he uncovers next raises serious concerns.
We then also came across a second email dated a year later in October 2016, which essentially looked very similar in terms of the content between the two. We thought that potentially, based on what happened with the salary increase, that this email had been forged as well. We spoke to the doctor concerned, and he had no recollection of sending that second email.
The forged email explains how the practice manager first managed to award himself £5,000. But what about the rest of the money he took? Daryl's team take another look at the company bank accounts that he managed.
So we were able to identify that a number of payments were going through payroll, so they were recorded as bonus payments on his payslip, but also we were able to identify that there were a number of bonus payments also being made directly to him from the practice's bank accounts.
On 2 occasions, the practice manager transferred £2,500 from the GP surgery bank account into his own. Then, in a final twist, Daryl discovers a mysterious transaction involving an ex-employee at the practice.
We found this information relating to a payment that had been made to a former employee of the practice for £450 for casual work.
Daryl's investigators look into the date the former employee was paid for working.
We then checked her access to key systems that she would have needed to have had in order to do this work, and her access had been terminated on the day that she left the employment of the organisation. That hadn't been reinstated, so there's no way she could have done the work.
With over £10,000 of National Health Service money missing, the practice manager is brought for interview.
He was fully cooperative and admitted immediately what he'd done. He was very remorseful. He said that he was very sorry for what he'd done, hoped that the practice, could forgive him.
Even though he puts his hands up, unbelievably, the practice manager continues to try to justify his fraudulent actions.
He said that the reason that he altered the salary email was because the fact he didn't feel that he was being paid what he was worth to the organisation, and that's what led him to put the increase.
But when presented with the irrefutable evidence contained within his diary, even he couldn't provide a reason for some of his actions.
We then produced the diary in front of him and referenced a overtime claim that he made in July, and asked him to explain to us how the hours that he'd claimed reconciled to the figure that it was in his diary. He then went on to admit that actually he was making up the hours that were going through onto his overtime claims, just again to generate additional money for himself.
And how did he explain the £450 he paid to the former employee?
He admitted to us that the person hadn't worked there, and actually she was in a relationship with the practice manager's son, and they'd actually moved into a house together. And the practice manager and his wife had agreed that as part of moving in, they would buy these two individuals a new carpet for their living room.
But when he realised he couldn't afford to pay for the carpet, the practice manager came up with a solution.
Then decided to make the payment out of the practice's bank accounts and to put something into the accounting system to make it look like she'd been working there on a temporary basis doing work for the practice when indeed she hadn't.
At no point in the investigation did Darryl find any evidence to suggest that the man's family were aware of the fraud. After the year-long case, the practice manager appears at Preston Magistrates Court. He's sentenced to 50 weeks in prison, suspended for 12 months, and ordered to pay £10,000 back to the NHS.
I don't expect there to be fraud in the NHS. I definitely didn't think it was going to affect us. Whatever money the NHS loses ultimately affects patient care.
I think this sends out a clear message that fraud is unacceptable in the NHS, and that perpetrators of fraud against the NHS will be prosecuted.
Back in London, a hospital accounts employee has been arrested for fraud against the National Health Service. After lying in her first interview, she's now given the investigator 3 names who she claims forced her to commit the crimes.
Each time they came, they would bring a different piece of paper with a different bank account on it.
And at one of their apparent meetings, the accounts employee claims things turned really nasty.
There was one occasion where she said that they'd all arrived and they'd carted Scott off into a car, and then about 20 minutes later he came back and he was bleeding quite profusely, so she said they'd clearly taken him away and beaten him up.
Even though the accounts employee admitted to lying in her first interview, Pat has no option but to take her latest version of events seriously. He accompanies the police to arrest the group for interviews under caution. Their homes are searched and their mobile phones are seized for analysis.
There were a number of questions about how these people were linked together and their motives. The majority of them provided no comment interviews.
With no evidence to link the group, the next step is to call the mobile phone network providers to gain access to their phone records and work out if there are any connections between them. The records show that the group have been calling each other, but it looks as though they're also communicating with someone else.
There was one number that we couldn't identify from any of the information that we had, but all of those other numbers were communicating with that one number. The network provider had told us that it had been taken out in the name of Billy Ben, like a nursery rhyme, like Bill and Ben, the Flower Pot Men. But clearly that's a made-up name, so we needed to find out who really was behind that number.
Then there's a development.
There were some no comments to the questions we put, but 2 of the individuals said, no, hang on, we didn't do that. It was actually Scott that was violent towards us, and Scott was the one that was coming around making us get money out of these bank accounts and give it to him.
The shocking claims paint a very different picture of Scott Chaplin, but who should Pat believe? Whoever's behind it, all the men Pat's arrested have had money from the Royal Marsden Hospital paid in to their own bank accounts.
13,701.84, 9,152.62, and then this quite large amount of money, £74,308.23.
And these payments went on for months. The The evidence against the suspects is building, but Pat still doesn't know the identity of Billy Ben, the owner of the mystery number, responsible for over 2,000 calls and texts to the group. In his search for an answer, Pat turns his attention back to the accounts employee's seized electronic devices.
When we looked into her iPad, we found some documentation from a venue where she and Scott were planning to have their wedding reception. The venue had asked them for their contact details, and she put her phone number down, but she'd also put down this mystery number as Scott's contact number.
Finally, the breakthrough Pat's been waiting for. With the mystery number identified as Scott Chaplin's, the pieces of the puzzle are finally starting to come together.
This chart is the phone association chart for Scott Chaplin. So this shows his links to all the other people in the investigation. This is his number here, the mystery number, but you can quite clearly see that this phone number is in contact with all the other parties in this fraud, every single one of them. You can see along these association lines the numbers of times that contact has been made. We've got 191 contacts. Going back the other way, there's 92 going back to Chaplin. Quite clearly shows that Scott Chaplin's at the centre of this. He's the architect of this fraud.
After a 12-month investigation, Scott Chaplin, the accounts employee and their accomplices appear at Southwark Crown Court to face charges of fraud and money laundering and stealing over £642,000 from the National Health Service.
In court, she stuck to what she told me in interview, and ultimately it was for the jury to decide whether or not they believed her. Scott was very similar to how he appeared at interview. He was quite casual, very relaxed. He gave his answers as if he believed them.
But the jury didn't believe any of them. They're all found guilty. For her part in the fraud, the accounts employee is handed a 4-year jail sentence. As the architect of the fraud, Scott Chaplin is given 5.5 years.
It was a big case, it was a complex case, it was a very satisfying result.
And there's good news too for the Royal Marsden. The banks managed to put a stop to over £330,000 and return it to the hospital's account. And following a proceeds of crime investigation, a further £110,000 has had to be paid back by the group, taking the total to £440,000 back in the NHS where it belongs. Today's cases prove that anyone who thinks they can steal from the NHS had better watch out. Up and down the country, investigators are on the case.